All right. All right. If you're in the back, if you want to come find your spot up here, it'd be wonderful to have you. So, thank you for those of you who have been in the other sessions so far this afternoon. Thank you for engaging in all the discussions and the presentations. It's been really exciting, and we're really looking forward to the last session of this first day of the Media Democracy Summit, which is a wonderful opportunity, and Nancy Karibjanian will say a little bit more about this in just a moment, the Byline event, which is in collaboration here, which is really exciting for us as a university. So I'm not going to say much more than this. I'm going to turn it over to Interim Dean Joe Trainor for the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and we'll get going from there. So here comes the handoff, the first of two handoffs. So this is going to go to Joe, and then Nancy.
I got it. All right, how we doing today? Wow, what a great set of events we've got going on for these next couple of days. Media and democracy, you couldn't possibly be more timely than that. As Tim mentioned, I'm Joe Trainor. I am the interim dean here at the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. I'm honored to welcome you to the Byline session and the Media and Democracy Summit. This summit is hosted, obviously, by the Biden School's SNF Ithaca Initiative in partnership with iMEdD. And at the Biden School, events like this are really important for us. They're important for us because here we prepare students to make a difference in Delaware, but also across the globe. So what I like to say is, we're Delaware deep, meaning we're well connected, but we are also a launching pad to national and international work. And we believe and expect that our students will have impact, will make a difference. We believe that every student, every single student, has the potential to become an outstanding leader. So what do? We prepare them for that. We prepare them for the responsibility by hands-on learning, real-world experience, and tangible skills building. In the Biden School, we believe in the commitment to public service, and it's especially poignant this week. So many of you may not know, this is, in fact, Public Service Week. That last part of the mission, that public service mission, especially in this environment, it's more important than it's ever been. We believe deeply, we still believe, that work done for public service, and what I mean by that, when I say public service, is work done for the public good, is noble. Not everybody believes that, but we do here. The SNF Ithaca Initiative is an important part of that effort. It's an important part of our effort to build tangible skills. And the skills that we're talking about here is equipping the next generation with the tools and the courage to engage across difference, to lead with integrity, and to strengthen democracy from the ground up. We're going to welcome leaders today and tomorrow that are journalists, scholars, civic leaders, and people across the media landscape to think about thriving in a toxic media environment. That question, thriving in this environment, thriving, not surviving, thriving, is important. I think it's really easy for us in these moments, in this time, to get down and to feel like we're just trying to get by. But I think what the moment calls for is something bigger, deeper. It calls for inspiration. It calls for creativity. It calls for deep thought and action. So tonight's Byline session, produced in partnership with the UD Journalism Program, who we'll welcome in a minute, brings urgency to that conversation. It brings urgency to our focus today. Before I hand off the podium and welcome our co-organizers here, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and Andreas Dracopoulos for making events like this possible. These kinds of events that we hold all throughout the year, they don't happen without the generous support of our donors. We can't have transformational experiences if we don't have the resources to make them happen, and that partnership really does make it happen. And then I just want to say something to our students. I hope tonight that the conversation challenges you, that it inspires you, and that it reminds you that the future of media is your future. And it's also the future of our democracy. And it depends on you educating yourself and taking action to ensure that your voice, your choices, and your views are expressed through the institutions that we rely on to preserve democracy. So with that, please allow me to turn it over to Nancy Karibjanian, the director of the UNI's journalism program.
Hi, everybody. All right, this is going to be a great night. We are going to be eavesdropping on one heck of a conversation. I can't wait. I've been waiting all week for this. It is extremely appropriate that we are working this year for Byline with the SNF Ithaca and iMEdD Media Democracy Summit. This has been a great day talking about how we can better communicate and preserve our democracy. And this year, our Byline event, which is the 4th year for UD Journalism's Byline, is supported by the E.A. Nickerson Lecture Fund and the SNF Ithaca Initiative in the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration. So the summit and Byline, they are timed at a really critical time in our society, but also timed right now at this point in the year to mark the 32nd anniversary of World Press Freedom Day. The United Nations formed World Press Freedom Day to highlight the importance of free and independent journalism. Think about what's happening with that in our very own country right now. I do want to give you a little note about Ed Nickerson before I introduce our guests. He launched the university's journalism program way back when, a little before I was a student here. Nick is celebrating his 100th birthday this month, and I am sure he would have been thrilled to be here hearing this conversation tonight. It would be right up his alley. So now, to our guests, which I can't wait. We are being joined by the national politics reporter for the New York Times and the voice that helped us put the 24 presidential election in perspective with his New York Times podcast, The Run-Up. We welcome to the stage Astead Herndon. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, it's another voice that we all know very, very well. It's a voice that has masterfully connected the dots for all of us of national politics for NPR. It is a fellow Blue Hen and NPR's senior political editor, Domenico Montanaro. Domenico, come on up. I'm going to turn it over to the guys. Let them take it. We will have time for Q&A, so stay tuned for that as well. All right, thrill me here, guys.
Well, thank you for welcoming us. It is a bit of a homecoming for me. I'm always happy to come up to UD. I'm a 2001 graduate, worked on the review student paper here, and whatever our small community can do to continue to support that journalism is really important, because I think what was said earlier about you guys being the future, kids here who are working on the paper and making it happen and put it out online and do some of the great reporting that it's done, even just over the last few weeks and a couple months, right? So I think it's super important. It's vital to a democracy. I idealistically really, truly do believe that still. I think that can be, obviously, land you in some political trouble sometimes, because our point, the thing that we are most dedicated to, is the truth, the independently verifiable truth. I'm not one who really believes in, I believe in journalistic objectivity, but not necessarily neutrality when you know the truth to be the truth. And sometimes that makes it really difficult when you have the powers that come after you for saying what you know to be true. But that idea of without fear or favor is super important, and we need more journalists to be out there doing the work independently. So thanks to you guys for believing in it and to continue to try to do it. So we'll start out a little bit, I think, talking about what a boring year it's been. Hasn't been much going on. I've noticed you hadn't had anything you've written about or talked about lately. Yeah, it's been a wild 100 days, obviously, of the Trump administration. You know, I kind of just wonder, Astead, because you've done so much work on this with the run-up and your podcast and everything, how do you feel like we've gotten to this point? I mean, you know, we don't have to go into like 50 years of history, but maybe just the, you know, what you see as the last, certainly you covered the last campaign.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I feel like even today the students have already made this such an enjoyable day. You know, our work on the run-up was really obviously focused on that question, and I would say even beyond just the result of 2024, we started the show really looking back to the Obama era and kind of political assumptions that had guided both parties and candidates at that time, specifically a belief that the way the country was changing demographically was moving in a kind of assumed direction of liberalism, honestly. So much so that I think our first episode, if I remember correctly, was actually about the 2012 GOP autopsy that Reince Priebus did after Obama won the second time. That said, if the GOP was gonna win, it was gonna be because they moderated on immigration and were able to win over Latino voters. And so many of those assumptions were busted up almost immediately in 2016, but I really think died their final death in 2024. And so one of the things that I wanted us to do was based in my own experience. So I remember the 2016 election night, as I'm sure we all do, about where we were. And I remember kind of feeling, and I don't wonder how you felt, but like, I remember kind of feeling betrayed by political journalism. Not just the result, but I think a mode of reporting that was not interested in your neighbor, that was not interested in context and kind of nuance of country. And I kind of made a self-promise that if I was ever in that position, I was going to try to prioritize the voices I didn't think were there. And so I think that was really helpful in 2020. I did that on the paper side. But as you know, there's bigger possibilities in audio. And I think there are opportunities to hear people you disagree with that sometimes you won't read. And so I was having these interactions on the road where I felt like I was distilling people down to these quotes, but they were actually more complicated. And so I was thinking, how do I actually present people in that more complicated fashion? And that's really where the podcast came from. But in 2022, when we were starting, you could feel a kind of palpable change from people from the recent election. It was not the kind of, I remember the kind of Biden premise of, the normalcy being freeing, but it wasn't normalcy we were really feeling, it was malaise. It was, I think, a lot of folks who have felt a kind of expertise, whether in COVID or BLM or a prescriptive version of how they were supposed to live, just wasn't working for them. And so it ended up being something that frames the work of our show about how people were trying to be distant from this election and not come to it. And so really, I think we got here because of a desire for disruption, because of a distaste for the status quo, and because of a feeling that I think, honestly, an overly rosy feeling of nostalgia to a pre-pandemic time, and not really about the solutions that Donald Trump was presenting. I remember all through last year asking people about, why do you think he would fix inflation? He talks about tariffs all the time. And that really wasn't what it was about. It was about a feeling that the current administration, I think a current kind of set of culture in society, didn't feel like they were listening to folks' problems. And so I think we're kind of dealing, as we go back and talk to some of these voters now, with the reality versus expectations of that moment. And, but the only thing I would add to that is the actual reasons people vote for someone are very distinct from what the administration takes from it, right? And so even as we go back to these people, their expectations of what the Trump administration was going to do, it's not my sense from them that they care, really. That they're trying to calibrate themselves to median voter, that they're worried about a midterms loss. I remember talking to one of the advisors who said, we're not gonna lose the Senate, and worst thing we do, we lose the House. It's a goal of expansion of presidential power, and it's a goal of kind of a 360 view of changing, of retribution, I would say, honestly. And so you could feel that change out there. His rallies were different. He was talking very openly about why this time would be different than the first time. But it's not as if that was what the electorate was taking from him, right? And so that gaps were really clear, and that really informed our work on the show. And so it was so much not about what's coming next, that I was actually trying to end the podcast on election day and say, like, who cares who wins? It was actually about understanding a country that can produce either result. And then the time zone there was too dramatic. But I really think that is what I think is the kind of macro view here, is like, I think, political structures that folks feel have not served them, and a Democratic Party that was pitching protecting institutions that too many people have already lost faith in. And I would include the media in that too.
Well, if you want drama, internally at NPR in 2016, I was pitching the 2016 election as an inflection point election. And I really think that that wound up being the case because you saw the pendulum sort of move and had the country sort of turn. And in 2024, I was saying that that election is, talk about drama, what it means to be American. But I really think that that's the case because I think that you have such a sharply divided country on strongly held values and beliefs on what the country should be. And people feel very strongly and very differently about what that means. What does red, white, and blue mean to you? What does it mean to say, I wave the flag, right? And what does it mean to you when you see the American flag? It means very different things for very different people. And we have a system in place where, you know, instead of talking about the 2026 midterms potentially, we have far fewer districts in this country that are truly competitive than ever before. Maybe 3 dozen or so. 3 dozen or so. There are 435 seats in the Congress. So when people say, oh, why isn't this Republican speaking out about something that they know not to be the case from Donald Trump or whatever, you can't judge politicians based on their willingness to stick their neck out for morals and values. Their job, what they view as what they want to do is to keep their job, right? You have to really look at them through that lens. Not trying to be cynical here, having covered politics for more than 20 years now, but the idea that everybody wants to keep their job and they're figuring out how can I best do that, and they're not incentivized to speak out against the president because most people in their districts are from districts where they're either very D or very R, and there's this very slim percentage where wanting to talk out or cross over or appeal to independence is really going to be something that matters, which is why you see right now someone like Don Bacon, the congressman from Nebraska, being one of the only Republicans you really hear saying something that might be counter to what you hear from the White House, and he's one of three Republicans in all of the House that won in a district that Kamala Harris also won in. I mean, when those numbers are that small, you don't have any incentive or reason to cross over to try to work with the other side.
And the thing is, and I think sometimes we talk over people, but they intuitively understand that. They understand that a political system is actually more polarized than country itself. It's my experience, honestly. And I feel like people have, the forced choice between D and R creates, I think, a malaise. And I think that played out most recently in this election. I remember talking to Senator Claire McCaskill, former senator, and she told me the worst thing that happened for the two-party system was the renomination of those two candidates, right? You can feel people drop off. And so I think that was really palpable. But I think you're pointing out a really important point about like the lack of competitive districts anymore, is because I think it obviously creates a different type of incentive structure, and we've seen that in Congress. I guess I was gonna say like that was a big change from from covering the 2020 election to 2024. I mentioned this to some of the students, but the 2020 election, there was mass interest. I was the New York Times reporter for the Warren campaign, the Harris campaign, was at all these Trump rallies, and you could really feel the fact that it wasn't just a politically interested audience that was invested there. By the time we were coming back for 2024, people were upset at the idea of you bringing the election to them. You know? And so it had changed our work. It changed where we had to go. I really put an onus on us as a show to not really try to be at political rallies because that's not the audience who's going to decide these things. We have to become more creative to find them where they are. I wonder for you from the White House perspective, what's the difference in covering the second version of the Trump administration than the first one?
I was just going to ask you a similar question. I think that the difference is that Trump is more prepared. I mean, he didn't really know governance in 2015, 2016. He just had sort of an idea about how he felt about things that were strongly held feelings for a very long time. I'm a New Yorker. I saw the Trump show for a very long time. So I kind of understood what we were kind of looking at when he came, to speak in Trump Tower. But he was a political novice. He was somebody who just wanted to be liked within the system. He wants the New York Times to like him, but he's going to talk trash about the media. It's a total Queens Manhattan thing, frankly, as a Queens person. It's like you want to be accepted by the city, but man, you hate everybody there because they don't like you at all. And that's a lot of psychology and chip on your shoulder if you think about like how then you go and operate in the world. And what Trump did getting into office is he surrounded himself with people who he heard from another person should be somebody that you can trust and rely on. And what happened was he figured that these are the kinds of people who I can trust, these are the kinds of people I can't trust. And there was a lot of that sort of working out. And while the Biden administration was happening, after Trump lost, he was sort of, and with Don Jr. and a lot of that MAGA ecosphere and the rise of these podcasts and all of that, not our podcast, different podcast, where they were able to figure out what MAGA means and what Republican establishment is and who believes what and who doesn't, right? And January 6th was kind of a dividing line for a lot of people where they were able to say, if you're willing to go along with this, to say that the election was rigged and we're going to do kind of anything to help Trump win and force his agenda through, then you were on board. And if you weren't doing that, then you were somebody who was going to be out. And we've seen that because they're screening people who come into the federal government jobs. They're asking them questions about their social media habits and what they've said in the past and all. They weren't doing that in the first term because they didn't have that level of sophistication yet. Now they do. And that's why he's been able to sign the 147 executive orders that he has, even though he's only signed, like 5 bills. And he's trying, when we talk about these next 100 days, I really think it's going to be defined by the courts and by Congress because he wants that big, beautiful bill through. There's going to be all of this fighting over Medicaid cuts if they do, and framing what is a cut. We've already saw Trump starting to talk about, well, it's not cuts, it's waste, fraud, and abuse. Not everything can be waste, fraud, and abuse. Not everything can be from Doge savings, right? But that's what some of the spin is going to wind up being and what we're going to wind up hearing. And I think the courts are going to be super important because we're going to see whether or not the cuts that have been made through Doge, whether the firings that have happened, whether the agencies that have been collapsed, if all of that stuff holds up in court, and if we wind up having an actual constitutional crisis where he defies the Supreme Court, or if he goes along with it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it, but I think it's really important. Like, if you're a Trump person around him by now, you have stuck through January 6th. You stuck through all the indictments. You stuck through, like, you got shot. I mean, they have been through several of these cycles, and it's weeded out some of the things you're talking about here. So much so there's a team of loyalists around. But I would say, and to go back again, it was really palpable how much the Republican electorate changed after the indictments. I remember being at this Times event, and I love my colleagues, but we were talking about the indictments, and I was like, I think they just made him the nominee. And they were like, yo, and it was so much of the Democratic premise. I remember being at the DNC in 2023. We did a show episode from there. It was at the time in which the party was making South Carolina the first state at the behest of the White House. And we were asking, you're not worried about some of these approval numbers? You're not worried about some of the polling or whatever? And the logic was that Donald Trump was going to get indicted, and that was going to inherently validate him amongst the electorate. And so they were okay with it being a referendum on Donald Trump because they thought that was a referendum that was going to help them win. And I just remember thinking, if democracy is really on the line, that's a really big bet, And it just felt as if it was so disconnected. It was such an assumption of an agreed belief about the fairness of our justice system that is not a shared belief. And so some of these institutional questions that I think you're talking about, I totally agree about the courts and Congress as these inevitable pressure points. I'm like, the purpose, and this is just me going to the rally, like, I don't even need to insider sources this. He tells you. The purpose of this second administration, is to push those pressure points. I think we see that with the economic system and tariffs. I think we see that in the growing fight with the courts. I think we see that in the reshaping of the federal bureaucracy. And so sometimes when we talk about the constitutional crisis or whatever, I'm like, I don't know if there's like a moment or standard or button where it become clear. And maybe the point is when might be a defiance of a Supreme Court or something like that. But I tell people, in their own words, the purpose of this next 4 years is to fundamentally reshape government and culture. And so I think the test is inevitable because that's what they came here to do.
Yeah.
And so even when we talk about some of these personnel decisions, I remember thinking about this. This is why I had to stop doing cable, because they don't want this answer, right? It's like, when they were asked about, oh, this individual person's fired, I would be like, it's true, whether it Waltz or whether it's, who was the first, or when Matt Gaetz was gonna be AG, I remember this being the real moment I said this was, it doesn't matter who Trump's AG is. I mean, it does in the specifics, but in the broader sense, he has a clear vision of what he wants the Department of Justice to do. And so whoever is in that role is going to be in that role because they're gonna execute it.
Right.
And so Gaetz was down, and then Bondi comes in, and there might be a new person after that, but it is the explicit and intentional point of this start. And to your point, I do not think that's where they were 8 years ago.
Right. I think the sort of ability to be able to go and dig in
Yep.
and know which direction they're going to go and who's going to be on their side or not to be able to push Trump's agenda is something different. We have a few questions from students that I want to get to. First one from Megan Ciano. She's a senior media communications and political science double major, minor in journalism, president of the Student Television Network and On. You want to go for it?
So the Trump administration has had a contentious relationship with the press, often labeling negative stories as fake news. So how have you changed your reporting of the White House or politics in general with this shift? And how do you ensure that your stories are grounded in fact?
Well, it's not new that a politician would target the media. I think anybody who's been a reporter, people in power don't like a lot of the things that you wind up writing. So you build up a somewhat tough skin, and you realize, especially in politics, a lot of times they're just trying to work the refs. This goes a little further than that. But, you kind of get used to the spin, you get used to hearing what you hear, but you have to stick to really firm ethical understanding of what it is you do and why we do what we do. For me, it's always been trying to take complicated things and make it understandable for regular people, and to be able to have in all of my stories the strongest argument on all sides. If I'm doing those two things, then I feel like I'm doing my job with the stories that I write. Rely on my editors to check my own biases, to be, open and honest about what my biases are so that I can then learn to fill in the gaps and treat people like human beings, be empathetic, and listen to them. It's frustrating when you go to a Trump rally and you want to hear what they have to say, you want to know where they're coming from, you have great conversations with people going into the rally, and then you're in the rally and the sort of WWE thing happens, and they're chanting at us and saying all kinds of nasty things. And I just remember this mom and daughter who had traveled from Dallas to Houston. It's a pretty far drive to go to this Trump rally, and we had a great conversation beforehand. I really felt like I understood them pretty well. And as Trump is basically chanting CNN sucks and stand press for the national anthem or whatever it was, I kind of made eye contact with the mom and daughter because they were doing the same thing, and they sort of just looked away, because they were in the mode. And that's a sad thing. It's also, though, our job is to cover what's happening and to explain it to people and make it understandable. So for me, that's how I attack my job. It would be nice if people appreciated it. I think some people do, but not everybody does, and that can be really frustrating. Even within my own family, I have people on both sides of the aisle, and I hear it from both sides about how we're not doing our job well. So,
Can I follow up? Has the trust and kind of building that been made more difficult this time around, as he's talking about NPR more specifically, about PBS more specifically?
Well, I think what's different about that is that not everybody listens to NPR. Not everybody watches PBS, although I think most people probably have watched Sesame Street or whatever, growing up, and I think those educational programs are super important, and unfortunately the news of it all gets lumped in with all of the rest of it. Obviously nobody wants to be called out, but not everybody pays that close attention to everything. What I have found is since Trump did that, and has been doing it, it's made it harder for us to do the thing that they say that we're not doing, which is talk to Republicans. And we try our best to get people on Capitol Hill who know us. I can't tell you how many times they'll say, well, I trust you, I like you as a reporter, but I just can't talk to NPR. Or, I like you as a reporter, but, with all the stuff that's going on right now, it's just some of the other people, other things. And so that makes it harder, and because we want to hear from everybody so that we can make sure that our information, that we're being well informed. I mean, right now Republicans control Congress. So my job, I remember when I was working at NBC News, I was on Capitol Hill for some months while we were in the overlap time where we didn't have a Capitol Hill reporter. And, I had such a blast getting to know John Boehner's staff, because they were leadership at the time. They were getting, things through, and, being able to tell people what leadership's thinking is really important. And I think that the specific targeting kind of detracts from and lowers the trust that we had, even with sources that we know well. And then with regular people, I've noticed more regular people are now aware of it, rather than people who just, before might have been like, oh, I don't even know what that is. Now they're like, oh God, whatever, even though they've never heard anything I've said. And I'm always happy if somebody has a criticism of something I've written or said or done. It's hard to defend the media, right? Because think about how niche everything is now, that it's impossible to do. There's another question, I believe. We have two more questions, and we can get to those. From Jeet Heslin, who's a senior political science major, minor in journalism, and content producer for the 2024 Delaware debates, so he's used to having a mic in his hand.
Hi, good evening. Thank you both for being here. My question is more towards just journalism as a whole, and you kind of just touched on this a little bit, how they should work to combat the growing resentment of certain Americans towards journalism and just the continuing belief that whatever you guys say isn't true.
Yeah, to me, this is a much bigger problem than individual politicians. And I spend a lot of time thinking about ways that we can do better in terms of growing trust. And frankly, a lot of ways I think we've lost trust. So the first thing I do is I don't work from the premise that their loss of trust is some invalid thing. And a lot of times I agree with them. A lot of times I think political journalism, to the point I said about my own disappointment in 2016, I think it's a totally legitimate feeling to have. And so what I do is kind of work from the premise of being a different type of proof point. When I would be out there, I would say, you're not talking to the scary New York Times, you're talking to me. And you're not just, if you think that there's something you won't hear, that we won't print or you won't say, try me. Why am I here otherwise? And so but for me, my biggest tool I have is going. I go. And when you're there, it is much easier to do that and to have a place of trust, to say that you're working from that premise. And so I put myself in situations, I went to Trump Stock, a openly kind of white nationalist conference in northern Arizona. I went to St. Cloud, Minnesota, as a group was trying to kick out Somali immigrants from their town. I'm saying and then when you're there, it's much easier to do. And so basically that's how I think about it. And I don't really try to think about, you mentioned this before, and I like that. I don't really think about objectivity in that way, because I think a lot of political journalism has been the performance of neutrality, trying to perform midpoint. I think about accuracy. I think about fairness. I think about, and I actually think that people interact with journalism a lot less, particularly coming from local newspapers. Those jobs aren't even there. They're not even seeing journalists in the same way. And so one of the things I do is make sure I take them through the process. Now, this is a little easier in podcasts because you can kind of show the work. But even in a story, I would say, this is the part I want to use. Here's how you follow up with me. It might come out on this day, all of those type of things, not assuming that people had that knowledge. But it wasn't, to be honest, Trump voters who taught me that. And I also get the question so much, I think, because there's an assumed distance from them. But I have a lot of identities. I'm Midwestern. I grew up in a fairly religious family. There's ways you can connect with people past nearly anything, right? But the real place I learned that was when I was at the Globe, Boston Globe, and I was the crime reporter, and I was saying this to some of the students before. Every day was the worst day of somebody's life, right? And so the act of going to fire, murder, drug overdose, all of those things, and having to gain trust in those situations was my real training. And telling people that there's real power in what we can do here. And then not working from a place of defending the media broadly. I actually be like, you're totally right. Media has only shown up to your community when someone died. That's not made up. you know? And so I'm saying, but you're gonna want a accurate and empathetic record of this day. And why not? Like, again, every new one though, you could point to your last proof point. And so you're trying to build that trust over time. But to me, the biggest difference in why I did a podcast this time versus writing in the paper is I thought I wasn't presenting that nuance in the language that people can most trust it. Felt like in the paper, I was asking you to trust the New York Times and the news, and I think for a lot of people, that trust is gone. And so I think that's unearned, to be honest. I think newspapers have values that are actually really important. But I think I've recognized the distance from those communities and the work I was producing. And so one of the things I could do on a show, though, is I'm not actually asking you to trust it because I work for the New York Times. You hear me go through the process, and you hear that kind of transparent vulnerability. You hear how I ask the question. You know? And so all of those things, I think, for the purpose of building up that trust.
And I could go on for a long time talking about what Astead was alluding to, which is the importance of local news. I mean, I started out at the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey, and it's been really sad to watch the further decline with the kinds of places that have taken over those newspapers and really kind of sold them for parts or hung them out to dry. It's really hard. At the time, our paper was owned by Gannett. I think it still is. And Gannett has this reputation for going in, taking over a newspaper. There were 175 positions in our newsroom that were dark, meaning they were not going to hire those 175 people back. And I know that like the stories that I did when I worked there, I didn't know if people were Republicans or Democrats. That wasn't the point. The point was, who's paying for this bridge that they're building? Where's the money coming from? What businesses is it going to put under the bridge? Which families are going to have their houses taken away because this bridge is too high for what it should be? Why is this, this thing going into this community where you've got 3 towns and a new development and traffic's going to one town, but all the tax revenue is going to another. That's the stuff that used to matter most because those are the things that are happening in your community. And now everybody argues about national politics and often a lot of things that don't actually affect them in their regular lives every day. That's not to say politics doesn't have an impact or affect you on a daily basis for a lot of people's rights. But the stuff that used to matter in communities, I think you see way less of it now because of directly impacted by the fact that we have fewer good, strong local newspapers, and it's a really sad thing.
I'll tell a quick story on this point about how local reporting helps build that trust. I remember when I was, again, at the Globe and on that crime beat, and I was having a tough time with all the cop interactions. And not in the way that I didn't think I should be doing them, but it was like, a little emotionally taxing. And also, I just wasn't particularly good at it, And I remember thinking, how do I create like a language that we can both speak? And so an editor, we were like talking about this, and I was like, all they do is talk about baseball. And he was like, well, listen to WEI. And so then I started on the road there listening to Red Sox radio, even though I had no interest in it. And so we would spend 10 minutes before talking about how David Price collapsed yesterday, and then they were so much nicer. And so I'm saying those were strategies that I had to learn. And those were ways that you grow in terms of creating comfort for people. But I think the onus is on you. Like, I think as a journalist, people do not owe me their time. They don't owe me their thoughts. They don't owe me to be vulnerable and open. And so I feel like it's an onus you should put on yourself to create something that then makes the work happen.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that ability to connect with people is super important, and to keep an open mind about where people are coming from and not to prejudge people for who they are. For young reporters, you should never feel like, oh, I don't want to go into that community because I don't believe the things that they believe. Like, no, you should be going into that community because you don't believe the things that they believe, or you didn't grow up the same way, so that you can understand where they're coming from, who they are, what their background is, what are the tapes in their head, right? What are their motivations? Those are super important things. I think we have a question actually about journalism again from Michaela Cook. She's a senior English and Media Communications double major, journalism minor, and in leadership at the Review.
Yes, I also wanted to ask about that. We've talked a lot tonight about the fact that it's not easy to work in journalism right now for a myriad of different reasons. And I wanted to ask you both advice that you would have for young journalists or just anyone already working in the field about how to stay, for lack of a better word, just sane and motivated in a profession like this that is under attack from so many different angles at a moment like this.
Well, I mean, number one, I think
You're assuming my own sanity.
Therapy helps. And I don't joke about that, to be honest with you. I think that it's really important for all of us to be grounded, to know who we are, and to keep the connections with the things outside of our work, to be able to keep going day to day. I mean, there is a level of disassociation that has to happen with us to be able to manage on a daily basis if there are attacks or death threats or nasty DMs or whatever. My wife is also a producer at PBS NewsHour, and she recently she's very funny, and she recently she went to a comedy class at the DC Improv and did this like 5-minute set. And one of the things she wanted to talk about was like the people's interpretations of what fake news is and going to the logical conclusions of people's fake news. But she was like, but I need a couple of your the nasty things people have said to you. Can you print a couple of those out? And it was funny listening to and horrifying to hear people's reactions to some of the really nasty things people say. But you gotta kind of just that's part of the game. It's part of what we sign up for. It's and I think that, as much as I believe in journalism, it took me a long time to believe and understand that work is not life, right? That you can't live to work, you gotta work to live, right? That's what one friend of mine who was a producer at NBC used to tell me all the time, and I used to just be so dismissive of that until I was in my mid-30s, and I finally, I have 2 kids, and I was just I need to reconnect with who I am and what I like, right? So I kept myself in my Thursday night basketball game. I play tennis. I play on the NPR softball team. That's just stuff I like because I grew up in a sports household with a gym teacher dad. So I make sure to do those things and to stay present in my kids' lives. Right? Go to the things that they do, take an interest. So, and to try to find some value in the journalism that you do. And I think if I look at the things that I've written, over the years, I'm proud of the work that I've done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't hit the mid-30s in yet, I need to find a family or something, I don't know. But so a lot of ways, to be honest, throughout my 20s, work was my life, I did the 2020 campaign trail. I told the students this, just to give you a scope of this, but when I was the beat reporter for, these campaigns, you gotta go when they go. And so I remember 8:30-ish, rolling over in my bed, and my boss had text me, when you read this, go to Michigan State Capitol. And so you would go, you would get in the car, you would do it immediately. I did that for years. And so it wasn't sustainable though. But I would say actually, I'm gonna give 2 earnest answers, is one, I channeled what I cared about through it, right? And that was really important to me. It was only worth doing if I didn't want to be a journalist for journalist's sake, I wanted to be a journalist for the reasons I thought journalism mattered. And I've had a very kind of tenuous relationship with it. I was like, if we're cooking, I'm gonna stay. If we're not, I'm gonna go. And actually worked because I think I was clear on what I cared about and bringing kind of voices to table that wasn't there, right? And so even if you look from city council to crime reporting to paper to now podcast, there's a consistency because it's actually just what I care about. And so no matter how much they yell at you on Twitter, that doesn't change, And so I think that's one thing. But 2, I would say I had to decouple myself from impact as your reward. I think that that's changing too. We're dealing in a different media environment. And I think when I started at the Times, it was so immediately a rush, You would tweet out your story, everyone would be talking about it would be on the front page, all of that type of stuff. And then I started thinking, Well, if you actually talked about like, if I'm gonna be legitimate to those communities I'm saying I'm caring about, they're not really in that space, you know? And so it made me want to present my work in the places that were the language where they were, in the mediums in which they were. But that's not gonna have the same level of like chattiness and the same level of potential impact that more traditional stuff is doing. And so I really started caring much more about the creation of a record, like in the old school newspaper way. I was like, I actually don't care if they listen to these people or not. It's true, you know? And so I guess removed myself from saying that the way it only matters if lawmakers act, or it only matters if a campaign, whatever. You know, that's not true. And so I think it actually improved it because I turned myself away from the places they have control over. Like Biden and Trump campaigns, and I think most presidential campaigns, so I shouldn't say this, particularly recognizing the space I'm in, and use access as a tool, you know? And so as you do things that they necessarily don't like, they can lower that over you. But they can't take the electorate. And at the end of the day, the election is the only thing that matters. And I think in this time, the bottom up is shaping a lot more things than the top down. We're seeing grassroots changes to both parties. And so I'm saying you can make your work, you can create a bubble for the things you care about and the people you care about, and allow journalism to be a vehicle for that. And that's basically how I solved the how you stay sane. I'm like, I control this. And whether they hear it or not is actually a them question.
Yeah, and you know, stay humble. I have kids, they keep me humble. When they were really little, they'd be like, ooh, daddy's on TV, like, oh, look. Now they're like 15 and 12, and they're just like, yeah, whatever. And I'm like, cool.
Well, these people
cool.
are happy to see you. We're going to have you turn it over to question and answers from our audience now.
Go for
Sounds
it.
great.
God forbid this happens, but if Trump succeeds in defunding NPR and PBS, what do you foresee?
Well, you know, we've been preparing for it for, you know, a little while, so none of this has been particularly surprising. And, you know, we're just trying to keep our heads down and continue to do the work. You know, we had layoffs 2 years ago where 10% of the staff was fired. I think that every news organization kind of goes through layoffs and those kinds of things. I think that, you know, our finance team is pretty proactive in trying to stay ahead of it. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I think the thing that's most concerning is really for more immediately, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily this year, because there's a lot of people who are stepping up at local stations to donate to local stations. But what happens in 2-3 years when the sort of news of this goes away and the funding also goes away, if it succeeds, that's where I think there's a real potential crisis moment for a lot of stations. And the ones I'm most concerned about are rural stations with small newsrooms in places where there is a total news desert. There isn't good local news. Yeah, I mean, the only news that exists are NPR or PBS stations. And there's no commercial incentive to keep those places open. There's no money that's going in to get a newspaper there or to keep the TV station going, to be able to check power in those local communities. And they pay dues for content to NPR, and every station, you know, the big stations may be okay, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, et cetera, Chicago, they may be okay, but their budgets are going to be reduced too because they rely on a degree of federal funding. We don't take really a lot of direct funding. We might expand for some funding for election coverage, but that's adding rather than, you know, relying on. Those stations, though, eventually, if they go under or if they need to reduce their budgets, then you see them sort of, you know, reduce their dues likely to NPR, and that can be potentially problematic. And, you know, for PBS, TV is more expensive to make than radio, so they take more funding overall. And, you know, I mean, just frankly, as a child of a nurse's school teacher who volunteered in her classroom for 20 years, you know, the 0 to 5 education, you know, gap is real, and you're gonna have way more kids starting in an abyss going into kindergarten without Sesame Street, and that's a real thing. So I hope that things change on that front, but you know, hopefully we can weather the storm.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. My name is Jay Abubakar. I'm a third-year strategic communications major from Hampton University. And you recently just brought up, you said that you became a journalist because of the reasons you thought that journalism mattered. I want to ask both of you, what were the reasons when you started? Have they changed, and what are they now?
Well, I kind of laid it out, you know, in there. I definitely think, I obviously think it matters. I think I grew up with it in the kind of impact way, right? Like, you know, my stories of journalism were Ida B. Wells, you know, were the Chicago Defender, it's actually really funny because, you know, I didn't have like some vision of mainstream media, you know? And it's not because I was above it. Like, my parents read like Chicago Tribune, but like the heroes of the story were about how mainstream journalism was missing things, right? Like, the civil rights newspaper heroes were writing against a New York Times narrative often. And so, you know, Dean Baquet, who used to be the editor there, would talk about how the Times missed in big ways the Great Migration, you know? That's huge. And so the stories that I told myself were always about those others and how you could use journalism as a vessel. But I think where I changed, and I laid this out, is I kind of got over the impact part. And I just thought, the record is what matters. The record of you know, they didn't hear Ida B. Wells at the time. Like, the Times just did their Overlooked series about all the stories that they should have, whatever. But I'm saying, at the time, it's the fact that she did the work, right? And so that's what motivates me. And I think that's where I feel like journalism has its true power, is like, I was thinking in this election, you know, I didn't know what I thought was gonna happen or what I thought, but I thought both results could happen. And I thought that 2016 feeling of not knowing why is where I can be coming, you know? And so I came into that day saying, whoever wins, I feel confident I know why, because I have actually talked and been enough places and heard people enough to see that these things are moving. And so that to me is the power of it, is like, you can be that connector for other people. And so many people we hear, and I think this is a very clear premise of the run-up, is like, let's go to spaces that would not have been here otherwise. And so that to me is the job, you know? And so not everybody has to do that. You know, not everybody needs to go to the white nationalist rally, but like, I can. And I think that there's actually power in me going and not the people who typically go. I remember thinking about politics. I remember like, you know, in the first version of national politics, people only asked me about black voters. And I love black voters. I write about them all the time. But I remember thinking, if I can't be at a Trump event, I'm not a full political journalist, you know? I wanna know that too. And so that to me is our role, is all of the above, and to play that kind of gap filler. And that comes with accountability sometimes, that comes with listening. You know, like, there's ways to do that differently, invest all of those different types. But really, we're talking about gap filling. And I think that that is the power to me, because I'm like, if they hear it or not, that record is still there.
You know, I jokingly say that I grew up in the land of presumption. And this is like pre-Trump or whatever. I would always be like talking to my dad and I'm like, but how do you know? Right? Like, how do you know that? I actually got in trouble when I was 8 years old in, I don't know if you guys know what CCD class is, the Catholic Catechism class, and the nun was telling us all these stories about, like, you know, Bible stuff, and I just like raised my hand. I wasn't being sarcastic. I just said, well, how do you know that? Like, what's the evidence for this to be true? And she was like, with questions like that, you're going to hell. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just an 8-year-old kid. I literally said that to her. But, you know, there's like that sort of like heart of a journalist to like want to find out, like, what is it? Give me the evidence. Let me figure out what this is. And I've always been sort of motivated by that, not necessarily listening to the rules and how you're supposed to do things, but trying to figure out what it is. Like, let's get to the heart of this thing and let's make it understandable for people who aren't necessarily doing this day to day. Was there one more you want to? We'll take one more question, I guess.
Testing? Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
There you go.
Thank you both so much. I love that this is called Byline, covering national politics in 2025. And I was curious, if you had to write a headline for covering politics in 2025, how would you describe it in just a few words or a quick sentence?
Headlines, a lot of workshopping that goes into headlines. Who do I work for?
The one you know less than you think. Like, like the rules are over. And I think people spend way too much time lamenting a time that is gone. And so I would say if you're gonna cover it, cover what's in front of you. Like, don't spend all this time telling me what you used to do, because it's done. So I guess like that's part, that might be youth, but I also think it was really helpful for me that when Trump was first elected and the Globe sent me there, I was 24, 3. So many people were just in shock of like the brokenness of the rules. And I just didn't even know them enough to be shocked. I spent all my time dealing with what's coming next, what's happening, And so I think in 2025, one thing the last election did is I hope it stuck a fork in demographic destiny and not understanding class differences between people, like assuming that identity politics or a shared language of democracy was something that everyone agreed on. Like those were assumptions. And so I don't care if the politicians miss it, because they miss a lot of stuff. Their job is, they live in self-preservation. I care when we miss it, because our job is the opposite of that. And so that was not a few words.
I guess for me it would be like, yes, that happened. All right. I think like I wanted to pitch a podcast for that, where it was like a daily thing where you just explain like, yes, that happened. Because I guess it's like, part of me is like, I'm not shocked by a lot of what's happening, and I have to reorient myself to remember that not everybody's following every kernel every day, because it always kind of shocks me a little bit when people think something else was going to happen. And I'm just like, why? Right? So I think it's important to pay close attention if we can. But yeah, there's been a lot that happened, and there's going to be a lot that continues to. We've seen the foundation laid, and I think Astead makes a great point that this is not, the rules of the road are not the rules of the road going forward, right? I think that we've grown up in a place. I grew up in a place where in the 1980s I was doing duck and cover drills because of nuclear fallout, not because of active shooters. I knew a time when the U.S. was the main superpower in the world, and who knew the 1990s were like peak America, right? And I think that's important for us to get over the fact that we're no longer, the post-World War II power that we were. That bipartisan consensus of how to approach the world is gone, and something new is being rebirthed. And that's what this volatility is. And that's what 2028 is going to be. And I think it's going to be super interesting, because you're going to have an open primary on both sides, provided Trump doesn't run and all of that. And it doesn't seem like he's leaning further away from teasing that he is. But let's just put that aside. An open primary between two new people from each party, a Democrat and Republican, post-Trump, post-Biden, post-Obama, post-Clinton, going to have to lay out a vision for the future of what it means to be American after what we had been thinking were the rules of the road. What are we going to be? And I think we're going to have two people who are going to duke it out, politically, for what this country is going to mean.
Yeah, I just really think that the democracy itself is just a thing that has been way less stress tested than we act like. And I think that the act of multiracial, like multi-class democracy, is a fairly new one in our history, in a fairly new country. And so I just think in general, the assumptions people have about the institutions that will hold or the norms that will save them, I don't think you should, because I don't think we know yet. And so we are going to get the pressure points. I just think that 2028 primary will be out of whatever the rubble, And I don't think we should presume to know what that will be, you know? Like, I feel like I can't, at least, presume to know who wins that, you know?
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for coming.
And on that note.
Appreciate that. We have a
So-
lot to look forward to.
Stay for just a second. So thank you very much for the conversation to Astead Herndon and Domenico Montanaro for joining us this evening. And I think you're both going to stick around for the reception, right? All right, so there were a few hands that went up that wanted to ask questions. You can ask those questions in just a few minutes when we leave this room. And in fact, go out that door and turn left, and then turn left again. And there's a reception just on the other side of that wall. So there will be a chance for some conversation, some food. And I will say, this is the end of the first day, but we have a second day. And in fact, if you are not registered for tomorrow, and you're like, man, this is really good, I'd like to come back. You, in fact, can. And we would encourage you to do so. So you can scan the QR code, and if you have questions about that or need help, we can help you outside. But I will say, just as a slight tease, the things that you were raising, the role of local media, we're going to be talking about tomorrow. Sustainability of journalism, we're also going to be talking about tomorrow. We've got historians who do this. We actually have, I don't know where she is in the room right now, but one of the development folks for NPR. Oh, there you are, right? So one of the people who is really working to make this happen. We've got a bunch of wonderful sessions starting the morning at 9:35. Encourage you to come and join us then. We'll go all the way through the night, ending with a couple sessions around the role of podcasts. And in fact, having a couple podcasters, including David Rubin and Tara Palmieri, at this time slot tomorrow evening. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and to Nancy and the whole UD journalism program. One more round of applause here. And we'll see you on the other side in just a moment. Thank you.